Good morning to all of those of you who are connected from the US. Good afternoon to those who are in Europe, and welcome everybody. Today we have a fascinating topic to discuss on trial, the 2020 US presidential election. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our gold sponsor, Munger, Tolson, Olson, our silver sponsors, Farr & Co. and Braden Head and Ritchie, as well as our bronze sponsor, James Moore Law Firm. Without any further delay, I would like to pass the floor now to the president of the UIA US National Committee, Peter Reyes. Thank you very much. Adios.
Thank you, Jorge. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Peter M. Reyes Jr., and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the UIA's US National Committee. The US National Committee is proud to present this UIA Capsule program today. In particular, I would like to recognize the organizing committee. Members of this program who include Grant Davis Denny. He is a litigation partner at Munger, Tolles & Olson LLP in Los Angeles, California. John Pinney of Braden Head and Ritchie in Cincinnati, Ohio. Marie Levin, who is the UIA representative to the United Nations and at Troutman Pepper in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And finally, our illustrious moderator for this program, Ian De Freitas, the UIA Deputy Director of Communication of Commissions, and who is also a partner at Ferrer and Company in London, in the United Kingdom. This incredible group of people met on a nearly weekly basis to put together this program. And the idea for this program actually came out of a meeting of the UIA US National Committee meeting. We encourage anyone who is interested to join the UIA. And for people in the US who are attending, we strongly encourage you to join not only the UIA, but the UIA's US National Committee. All are welcome, and we'd love to have you join us. Now, I want to turn over to Ian to begin with the program. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. The term on trial in the title of this webinar is relevant not only because of the controversies that the election generated in America, but also because the apparatus for that election was severely tested as never before. We need to remind ourselves, I think, that this election was conducted at the height of the COVID crisis. In the weeks leading up to polling day, 80 to 90,000 people were being infected every day in America, with daily death rates hovering around 1,000 per day. And those figures were surging as we approached November the 3rd. To discuss the challenges this created and the aftermath, I'm delighted to welcome our panel. Rather than me introducing them, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. So perhaps if we could start with Michael Maley in Australia. Michael, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to introduce myself, I'm coming up to a 40-year milestone in a career as an electoral official. I spent 30 years at the Australian Electoral Commission, and for 20 of those years I was running their international programs. And I've also worked around the world for bodies such as the UN, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and the Commonwealth Secretariat.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for joining us. And Nate, would you like to say a few words?
I'm Nate Pursley. I'm a law professor here at Stanford and also co-chair of the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. And I used to be the research director of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration.
And Jessica, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, yes, I'm so excited to be here. My name is Jessica. I am the editorial director for VoteBeat, which is a nonprofit newsroom in the United States that covers voting and election administration. And I was previously the lead elections reporter for ProPublica's Election Land Project.
Thanks, Jessica. And finally, Kevin.
Sure, Ian. Thank you for having us. And thank you, Jorge and Judge Reyes as well. My name is Kevin Greenberg. I am a partner at Greenberg Traurig in Philadelphia, chair our Pennsylvania government law and policy practice. And I'm also the general counsel for the Pennsylvania Democratic Party and involved in a bunch of state law issues and chair of the election bar in Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Thank you all. What we're going to do, just so the audience understands, is we're going to conduct this more as a discussion, a conversation, rather than a series of speeches. Please use the Q&A if you've got any questions. We'll get to that at the end if we have time. And Peter is going to keep an eye on that for us. So he's going to pick out the most interesting ones. And then, as I say, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible if we can at the end. We've got an hour and a half, so we should have plenty of time. So let's get into the panel. So before we get into the main areas for discussion, I just thought, Nate, if you could explain to us how US presidential elections normally work briefly, and then that'll set us up for the rest of the discussion.
Sure thing. So as many of you know, the US runs its election for its highest office, unlike any other country in the world. We do not have a direct popular election of the president, but instead we go through the arcane system of the Electoral College. This is a residuum of the fact that, you know, we were a collection of states back in the late 1780s when this system was designed. And so each state has a certain number of electors that it is awarded based on its population. And you know, you get a majority of the electoral votes, and then you are, you know, you become president. And as was true twice in the last 20 years, just because you win, you know, even if you lose a majority of the votes total nationwide, you may still win the Electoral College. In addition, but the Electoral College is part of a sort of larger feature of American election law, which is the incredible state decentralization of our system, so that we devolve power down to the state level, which is further devolved down to the counties. And so the rules for elections vary quite considerably between states and sometimes even between counties. And so a lot of the controversy and you know, the post-election complaints revolve around, you know, different rules that different states had with respect to the election. But that sort of critical feature of decentralization of the American electoral system, it really sets us apart, as does the fact that we, you know, often have elected officials who are the ones who are in charge of the administration of our election. And so that we do not have a robust, nonpartisan, say, national election authority like many other countries in the world. It's devolved down to these state officials.
Okay, and could you just briefly explain the difference between the different ways that the voting can take place? So, you know, in our country, we tend to do it all on the day, but I think you do things slightly differently.
So there are three kind of paradigms for the way that we vote in the US, but there's a lot of sort of space in between them. So that there, you know, historically we think of voting on election day in person as the paradigmatic way that Americans vote, so that people go to their local polling place and show up and cast their ballot. Over the last 30 years, we've really moved away from that, so that this was an election actually where the majority of voters did not vote on election day. In fact, we had over 101 million votes that were cast before election day, either vote by mail or vote early in person in early voting centers or polling places. And when we say vote by mail, we don't necessarily mean that they put it into the post, that it was done by the Postal Service. Sometimes people vote early, you know, on paper that they receive at their home, and then deposit it in drop boxes that some states and localities have, or they return it to the election office. But we saw this sort of meteoric rise in vote by mail, so that roughly 40% or so of Americans actually voted by mail in this election.
Okay, thanks, Nate. Thanks for that explanation. And Jessica, could you just explain how you declare the winner? How do we know who's won?
That should be a simple question to answer, shouldn't it? In the United States, there is, of course, only one way that the president is declared, which is that the ballots are counted and certified by election officials. But there is this also sort of side process that is happening on the broadcast media and with several large print organizations, which is that the journalism community bands together and does exit polling and surveying and then looks at at results predictively using political scientists in our call room to project elections, to see if we can, kind of know the winner before the winner is announced. And so this media call, the projection, has oftentimes been confused with the official vote count, which is, I think, why folks were so intent on knowing the result of the election on election night. We have, in fact, never known the results of the election on election night. We simply know what the media is projecting using statistical modeling to be the result. Obviously, that didn't work out very well in 2000. So there is margin of error here, and I think it's become a little bit too conflated.
Okay, but eventually, I mean, normally what happens, as I understand it, is that maybe the next day the candidate who's lost gives the famous concession speech, and then everybody
that is true.
Sort of goes home. Yeah.
That often happens. That's an important piece of American tradition. It is not necessary for the transition of power to happen. Donald Trump never really gave a concession speech. He is not president. So I think there's a lot of historical importance wrapped up in that, but it is not necessarily procedurally necessary to move on to the next administration.
Okay, thanks. So Nate, turning specifically to 2020. At the top, I sort of mentioned, COVID. I mean, what problems did that pose to the election process, and what steps were taken to address them?
So if you go back a year or so, it was unclear whether we could even pull off this election. And if you look at the primary elections that were taking place in March and February, there were real alarm bells that were ringing about our ability to sort of get the election infrastructure up to the standard that would be necessary in order to, have an effective presidential election. At the time, you go back, say, to the Wisconsin primary, you had places like Milwaukee that were closing 97% of their polling places. And the Wisconsin governor even called out the state's National Guard to help staff polling places. There was in New York, when it held its primary, New York City ended up having so many mistakes with its absentee ballots, the mail ballots, that they ended up canceling 20% of them. So we were in pretty desperate straits when it came to in the primary elections. But the election administrators really sort of learned lessons and dedicated themselves over the succeeding 7 months or so to adapt to that environment and to make sure that we could make this massive transition to mail balloting. Many states had rates of mail balloting of 3% or so, but places like North Carolina and those in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, that hadn't had robust mail balloting put together the infrastructure to do so. And the same is true with healthy polling places. There was a national recruitment effort to make sure we had enough poll workers for the polling places. A group called powerthepolls.org actually did a lot of that. Because most of the average age of a poll worker is roughly 65 years old in the US. And so they were the ones most at risk for the pandemic. And so that we needed a whole new crop of poll workers. And what ended up happening was, despite these incredible obstacles, you ended up having record voter turnout in the United States. And an election which really saw very few problems, so that the mail balloting system worked relatively well, very few canceled ballots like what we had seen in the primaries, very little in the way of polling place malfunctions. So the election administrators really stepped up.
Thanks, Nate. But Jessica, so it seemed to work well, but I know you've got some perspectives on the way the media approached to explain the differences that there would be in this election cycle. Could you just sort of explain that to us? That it seems to be the root of some of the problems, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, of course. I think that the media was trying to figure out how elections were working in the United States alongside everyone, and it was changing every single day. And there were certainly some missteps by the US media during the course of this. I think that the US media, for example, was very eager to embrace vote by mail as a panacea to all of our problems at the start of the election, and then quickly realized that logistically it would be difficult to do all vote by mail because states and localities simply didn't have the equipment. And some of those states and localities built up their capacity for vote by mail, and people were able to do that with a lot of success. But I think that there was quite a bit of confusion at the beginning. And I also think, and I talked earlier about the difference between the projections and the results. And I think that the media, once Donald Trump began to spread misinformation about how the results must be announced on election night, we began to explain the process of election projections and how it's very separate from the actual count. But that's not a misinterpretation that the American public should have had from the beginning. We should have been explaining how projections worked the entire time we were doing them, and we've been doing them for decades. So I think that there needs to be, in addition to additional transparency around elections, I've always seen the media as part of elections. Most people are not getting their information about their candidates or how to vote or where to vote from their local Secretary of State's office. They're getting it from the media. We can serve as an arm for good voter education, but we're going to have to start being more transparent about our own practices before we can do that effectively.
But I guess, to be fair to me, just coming back on you on that, this was a bit of an experiment for them as well. I mean, it's pretty unusual. So
it was all of this was unusual. And I think people kind of lose sight of that the media are people too. And we were also living through this pandemic and like trying to figure out how to multitask with our children at home and broadcasting from our corners. And so I think that it was an environment that was quite ripe for confusion. And the media should take its licks for that, but also we're people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll come back to this, what's going to happen in the future towards the end of our conversation, but we'll get to that. I'm now going to turn to sort of where I feel slightly more comfortable. I'm going to talk to a lawyer, to Kevin. Kevin, let's start by looking at some of the issues. You're in Pennsylvania. Let's look at some of the issues that were going on in Pennsylvania around March, April last year. Could you just explain what those were?
Sure, Ian. And I'm actually going to take you back one step before then, which was before the pandemic. In October of 2019, the Pennsylvania legislature made the change that Nate was talking about to allow vote by mail and early voting as part of an election reform that we hadn't had in Pennsylvania in almost 40 years. And so when we did that, one of the things the Republicans got was they took away straight ticket ballots, a bunch of things, but the governor insisted as part of the deal that we allow for vote by mail and early voting. And it turned out to be prophetic that it was needed to happen. So that happens in October. Those changes were supposed to take effect with the primary that was scheduled for April 28th. But were not going to be in effect for the special elections that were happening between then and April. And there were 3 that were scheduled for March 17th. Again, everybody in the world experienced this differently. By March 17th, Italy was in lockdown, but here in the United States, it was still taking effect. I was in court on March 13th. On March 16th, it was the first day my kid didn't go to high school. So it was just beginning to take effect. And we had these elections scheduled for March 17th. And to talk about what Jessica was, the media was freaking out. Everybody was asking for change. The authority to move the election belonged to the legislature, which wasn't meeting that week. And so these elections went ahead anyway. And what we found out, and this is an important fact to think about this, is Democrats did not come out and Republicans did. And so 3 elections, there were 3 specials. One was a safe Democratic seat, one was a safe Republican seat, and one was supposed to be close. The Republicans won all 3 races because Democrats just didn't go to the polls. And so that animates a lot of what comes next. Then we get to the legislature coming back into session the first week of April to deal with this. And they frankly do nothing with respect to the pandemic generally. They leave that to the governor's powers. But the one thing they did, well, 2 things they did. One was they passed a law allowing for a differently run primary in June with less polling places and things like that. And the second was they pushed the primary to June 2nd. And so as a result, we sort of missed the problems that they had in Wisconsin and the problems that they had in a couple of other states where they were trying to do this before they understood what happened. We still had a primary in June that was complicated for the biggest reason that it happened to be on June 2nd. We were in the middle of the riots following the police murder of George Floyd. So you end up with another crisis on top of a crisis in Pennsylvania. And so, I mean, we can get there in a second, but that was sort of March and April.
Okay, so pretty chaotic. So then, as I understand it, the sort of the litigation started to kick off in around June time, around the summer.
Yeah. So we had this primary on June 2nd.
Yeah.
And the most important components, there's three things that happen on election day that are going to telegraph through the litigation over the summer. The first is that because of these riots in essentially Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but there were 5 counties in Pennsylvania where they were under a state of emergency for the riots on top of the state of emergency for COVID. The governor gave a 7-day extension for ballots in those locations to be delivered. The mails weren't being delivered. And so it was literally the week leading into the election. Everybody was voting by mail. The governor gave this order, gave a 7-day extension. Nobody really objected to that. We'll come back to that in a second, but that ends up being really important later on. There were 2 other things that happened. One is that a bunch of governments put out drop boxes outside their election offices because they didn't want people coming into the office. That had been talked about happening for November, but it happened faster and with less planning than one would have expected because of the pandemic. Now, there were basically one of these in each of about 15 counties, and they're just places where the county elections offices are largely in city halls or courthouses, and they didn't want the public traipsing in and out with what we all thought was a very infectious disease virus at that point. Well, we know it was a very infectious virus, but we were all terrified. We didn't know what was going on. And so they had these drop boxes put outside. And there was a lot of complaining about that from the people who were dedicated to misinformation, as Jessica put it. And then the third thing that happened was on election day itself, there were 2 counties in Western Pennsylvania. It turns out there were actually 3 that weren't counting what we call naked ballots. And so these are ballots in Pennsylvania, and I think in most states, the way you vote by mail is you vote your ballot, you fold it up, put it in what's called a privacy envelope. So that then you put that envelope inside a second envelope so you can mail it in with all your information on the outside, who you are, things like that. Once they validate that your ballot is an appropriate ballot to be counted, they then remove the outer envelope and take the inner envelope and put them into a big pile and then can stir them around and mix them up. And that's how they protect the anonymity of the vote, is that all of the inner envelopes are put together, commingled, and that way they don't know that Kevin Greenberg voted for Joe Biden, as an example. But what happens if you don't include an inner envelope? Historically, the counties had counted those. What you do is you cure them. You take that, when you open the outer envelope, you say, oh my God, they didn't use an inner envelope. Here's an empty blank inner envelope. We'll put it right inside. We'll seal it up. We'll put it in the pile to be mixed up. That was probably a violation. We now know it was a violation of the strict letter of Pennsylvania's election code. They should have thrown those ballots away. We didn't think so at the time. It had never been the case. But these 2 counties, as I said, turned out 3 counties were doing that. And there was some litigation on election day about that. It ended up being moot for all of the elections in the primary. None of those ballots mattered. So it got dropped the next week. But those are 3 issues that carry forward into litigation that then starts for real 3 weeks later. Because what happens then 3 weeks later is the Trump campaign goes into federal court in Pittsburgh. And as Nate talked about, we have a very different federal and state system. We also have federal and state courts that interpret those laws differently and interpret different laws. And so they go into federal court and they filed an action in federal court saying it violates the US Constitution and the state constitution, they said, for us to use drop boxes, for us to use early voting, which we call something different, but is early voting, and to count these naked ballots. And so they wanted the court to say, stop, don't do it, go back to the old way. But by the way, get rid of the straight ticket balloting that was part of that deal. So it was a very much a strategic decision by the Trump administration, understanding that Democrats were voting by mail and voting early and Republicans were voting on election day. And that's what we had seen happening around the country. And it was feeding into the narrative Jessica was talking about. The Democrats, I was the lawyer for them, but my clients had been holding our powder till after the election was certified, when we were going to go to court and ask for the exact opposite, to count all these things and go down that road, and to add for a couple of other things. And so what ended up happening is on July 10th and 11th, we essentially do that, but we go to state court because these are issues of state law and they're more appropriate there. Strategically, I don't think it's any secret that the Democrats have a 5-2 majority of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and the Republicans had at that point a 5-4, later became 6-3 majority on the US Supreme Court. And so we wanted a better form from a strategic standpoint, but it was also it was the right place to go for law because these are issues of state law, as Nate talked about. So on July 10th, we filed an action in Pennsylvania asking for the reverse of what the Trump campaign asked for, plus 2 other things. We asked for a 7-day extension for the receipt of ballots in November. And we asked for the counties, if they were going to disregard a ballot, to be forced to contact the voter to come in and fix it. We didn't think we were going to win the last one, but it was an attempt to change the discussion. And then we went to the federal court and said to the federal court, hey, we'd like to intervene in this case because we were not part of it, but we asked to be in it. And then we said, and we think the court should stop. We think the federal court should exercise what's called the Pullman abstention doctrine. So abstention is another one of those things that goes back to that federalism issue Nate talked about. It's very rarely used, but basically it's a doctrine that says, while federal courts may decide issues of state law legally, there are many times when it's better for them to not do so. So particularly in this case, it's a unique area of state law. The Pennsylvania State Court is uniquely suited to do it. And if the federal court were to decide it, and then the state court were to come out another way, you'd have confusion, and the state court would be the dominant one because it was an issue of state law and state constitutional law. So we went to the federal court and said, stop. Now, I want to be clear. This is not an attack on the judges. This is about the federalism issue. And I want to be clear too. The judge who got this case, Judge Ranjan in Pittsburgh, was a Republican Party official before he ran for office and was appointed by Donald Trump and confirmed by the Senate in essentially a party line vote. So but he was incredibly fair, incredibly diligent, but we're not going to hear any of the complaints about there being bias in the courts. This was a Trump judge. And so we went to him and did this. And he took it under advisement and was considering it, and at the same time put us on a crash litigation course, a crash discovery course. So we had depositions of all sorts of state officials, of county officials. This was going crazy. We went in about a month and a half. It's important to know, and Jessica and her peers picked up on this. I was thrilled because we didn't put it out there, but I was sort of surprised they did. The court, we had to move to get the court to order them to give us some information discovery. And the Trump campaign's evidence of fraud was a 20-year-old case where there had been real fraud, no question, but back in the 1990s. And that was the evidence that Trump had of fraud. There was nothing there. And so that sort of laid the groundwork for what followed. At the same time, this is going on in federal court. And by the way, in late August, Judge Ranjan does exercise Pullman abstention and grants our motion to stay. He basically stepped out of it and said, I'm going to let the state courts deal with it. We're going to deal with it now. We're going through the state court process in parallel. And we get to a point in August where things have sort of stalled out and we don't know where to move. And the state of Pennsylvania, the governor's office and the secretary's office went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to exercise what is, I think, a unique power in Pennsylvania law called King's Bench. It actually goes back, Ian, to English law, where the Privy Council could reach down and take any case from any place in England at any time. Pennsylvania Supreme Court has that power as well. It can reach down into any case, regardless of anything else, and take a case. Doesn't use it very often. Incredibly rare, frankly, but they did. It was asked for. We did not oppose it. Nobody actually opposed it. The Trump campaign sort of said something wishy-washy, but nobody opposed it. And on September 3rd, they grabbed the case, put us on an accelerated briefing schedule. And on September 17th, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court largely ruled in our favor on this. They said drop boxes were okay, early voting was okay, and that we didn't get 7 days of extended mail time, but we got 3 because the Postal Service wasn't doing its job. We end up litigating that 3 days for months thereafter, and it ends up being irrelevant, but that's neither here nor there. We lost 2 things. The one I thought we was going to lose, that the counties didn't have the capacity to call all these voters, even if they wanted to. And then we lost the naked ballot piece, which was actually a surprise to me. And as I said, I think was an appropriate reading of the strict law, but very different from how the Pennsylvania state courts had always looked at the voter intent and empowering voters in the past. The best part about it all was because I put the words naked ballot into my filing and sort of made a thing. That's always been an inside baseball term, but nobody used it. I actually had to overcome some objections from co-counsel about being impertinent. but it led to some wonderful videos from celebrities posing naked, telling people to make sure they use the ballots the right way. So it was just a terrific, you know, it ended up being a fun story. And it was entirely because we sort of went down that road. But you know, that's sort of where we get to before the election. We then go to the Supreme Court because the Republicans try to make this a US Supreme Court case on the 3 days on all these decisions. And the US Supreme Court chooses multiple times. One time it's the circuit judge. One time he refers to the whole court. They choose to not engage before the election. And that process is going on. I will only point out that this was a very different process than what happened in a lot of other states. In a lot of our peer states, these cases got fought out in federal court. And that was sort of where certain Democrats pushed these cases because you had a Republican Supreme Court at the state level. They went to federal courts, made a strategic call. And these cases all got there. There's a doctrine of law going back to some Arizona redistricting cases about a decade before that said, and some other cases that say right before an election, the federal court stay out of the administration of state elections. They don't want to, again, it's a federalism argument, but they don't need to be involved. And so what happened in a lot of our case, we won and we got the outcome we wanted. And we had an activist court giving direction, at least according to some people. The federal courts, even where they did intervene, such as in Wisconsin and North Carolina, they got slapped down by the appellate courts and were basically told stay out of the process. And so we did have a different process in Pennsylvania, I think, in terms of setting the groundwork for why we had so much after the election. I mean, we had all this after the election fighting for two reasons. One, we had this different procedural process that we pushed. And the second is that we were closer than anybody other than Georgia and Arizona, where they also had craziness.
So, I mean, you know, as we lawyers say, choose your court or your judge wisely. So you get the result that you want, or you get the best chance. No, I understand that entirely. So just moving forward, so we arrive at election day and we get into the immediate aftermath. Jessica, I mean, I was watching all this, and you know, as an outside interested observer, the process of counting votes, it seemed to take forever in certain states. I was amazed how long it took. Why was that? And what I didn't get the sense of from watching CNN was any sense of you know, an explanation of why that was happening, why it was taking so long. I mean, can you
Yeah, I will try to explain it succinctly. I mean, the root of the delay is really in the massive differences between the states and the equipment that they have and the ability that they have to count ballots in various ways, right? So we moved to vote by mail in this hugely new way. A lot of states are not used to this at all. In a lot of states, people vote on a machine and they go boop, and then the machine counts it at the end of the day, and then that's the count, and we verify it and we audit it, but it's a simple process. When you introduce literal metric tons of paper into the scenario, things just get a little bit more drawn out. So, you know, I think that people don't really have an appreciation for how much space ballots take up. So if you think about an 18-wheeler, a semi-truck, that truck can contain 250,000 ballots, not the outer envelopes, not the instruction manuals, just the ballots. So we're talking, and in like Maricopa County, which is being audited right now, there are 2.1 million ballots. We're talking about 4 semi-trucks worth of ballots that need to be counted. And it takes a long time. And there are states that have fantastic high-speed optical scanners that are very expensive that can do this work very quickly. There are states that do not. And so the counting process is just very different by state. And the closer the count becomes, the slower the count ends up going, because the election administrators want to make sure that they're crossing all of their bases. They then have to count provisional ballots and absentee ballots after the normal ballots have been counted in some states. And so it just draws the process out for a really long time. And I think that, you know, differences in equipment is not a very exciting or sexy topic to hear about on CNN, but was truly the root of a lot of our delay.
Nate, I know you've got a point on this, but.
Well, let me just say that it took us 4 days to count over 140 million ballots, right? And so it was 160 million ballots by the end. And so I'm not sure whether that's fast or slow. I mean, you know, you look at other countries, and they do have a week or two in which they end up counting ballots. But for all the reasons Jessica said, that's why it took longer than it had historically. It is a bit of a miracle, isn't it, that historically in the United States we have known the winner of our presidential election by the night of the election day itself, right? That has been the tradition for many, many years. Primarily in the age of television, right, where everything is, so accelerated. As Jessica said, though, right, these are always based on the media projections, right, where you get enough information from the raw counts that then you can have a very high degree of confidence as to who actually won. Here, because the mail ballot pool was different than the non-mail ballot pool, meaning that there were a greater number of Democrats who were voting in the mail ballot, voting by mail than Republicans in a lot of states. Some of the traditional models where you might think that all the votes would kind of be the same, the media organizations needed to be cautious. In addition, you had very close elections in Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. And so some of the media organizations were rightfully hesitant to make projections at that point, even though we had, Biden's winning by, many millions of votes nationally. The election really came down to about 40,000 votes spread around those three states. And so you had a close election with new types of technology and new sort of voter behavior. And so that's what led to the, long count of 4 days, right? I mean, that's basically what it took before the media ended up calling it. Now, as Jessica said before, we've never really known the winner of an election, either on election night or really on election week, in terms of the once the votes are counted. So, California, where I live, always takes its sweet time, but it's not competitive, so people don't worry about the fact that we have many millions of ballots that are not counted on election night or even in the week of the election. For example, in the 2018 election, it took several weeks and ultimately several congressional seats flipped as a result of these late ballots. With places like Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, which don't have the history of absentee balloting, then it will take a little bit more time in order to get it right. But they did, having it done within a week is a remarkably fast period in a close election.
And there were some quite stark differences, weren't there, between the in-person voting returns and what you got on the other voting methods? I mean, I think you looked at some of the stats on that. It was quite striking.
Well, that's right. I mean, part of what happened was that because President Trump was so against mail balloting and in the pre-election period, claiming that it was filled with fraud and the like, you ended up seeing a greater divergence between the ways that Democrats and Republicans had voted. This historically had not been the case. Republicans and Democrats in certain states had voted with mail ballots at the same rate. In fact, if you go back a decade or so, that Republicans, if anybody was having an advantage, Republicans were the more likely voters to cast votes through the mail. But because of the partisan valence that was cast over the mode of voting this time, you did see a divergence in the way that different voters based on their party cast their ballot.
I don't know, Kevin, if anything odd was going on or, looked a bit strange in Pennsylvania regarding the vote counting. I mean, that was one of the ones where it was on a knife edge and then it sort of swung one way and then went the other.
So it was, but it wasn't. And that is a function of, again, going back to when Nate talked about it, that we have 67 counties in Pennsylvania and we have 67 different systems. But more importantly, the vast majority of Pennsylvanians live in 6 counties: Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is, and then Philadelphia and 4 suburban counties around it. And those counties were all blue. The people who live in cities tend to be Democratic. People who live in near suburbs these days tend to be Democratic. And so you had a situation where the small counties with 20 or 30,000 people, many of whom voted in person, but they could get done on election night. And so you had a situation where the Republican counties were reporting earlier, where the Democratic counties in Philadelphia, we had something on the order of 500,000 mail ballots, and it was just taking time. At 2 o'clock on election morning, I was told by the campaign people in Pennsylvania that we won the state by 75,000 votes. Turns out it was about 82,000 votes, but it was a remarkably accurate number because they had seen what was coming in as they opened the number of mail ballots. We knew where they were. We knew that the mail ballots were likely all homogeneous within a county, but they were different from the machine ballot. And so we had machine ballots everywhere. We had mail ballots, a significant sample from every county. And so we said 75,000 votes in Pennsylvania on election at 2 a.m. that morning, and went to bed knowing we'd won Pennsylvania, knowing we'd won the election. But that's not what the media showed, because what the media got early on were the in-person vote counts and then the mail counts from the smaller counties. And so they were showing this red sweep that as Allegheny County and Philadelphia County and the suburban counties around Philadelphia came in, moved back the other way. And it was predictable, it was knowable. I remember having a conversation with a couple of media members on Wednesday evening, where they acknowledged that Joe Biden had won Pennsylvania, but they could not convince their decision desks to make the call until the official results known to the secretary showed Biden up by a small handful of votes, because that way they would not be calling something different than they didn't want people looking on the website, seeing Trump's ahead by 100,000 votes and calling it for Biden, even though we all knew what was there just by knowing what votes were outstanding. And so you had this thing that was going on top of which we had COVID and COVID protocols. There was one incident on, I think it was Friday morning, where I got called and rushed down to the convention center. And to talk about Jessica was talking about, we took over the entire convention center in Philadelphia and had vote counting operations there, and there was an area to watch it. Well, Corey Lewandowski and a bunch of Republicans were trying to storm the convention center. We thought it was a repeat of the Brooks Brothers riots in Miami in 2000. Turns out that got stopped by the security people. But Lewandowski was there, was yelling and screaming. He got inside, he got to watch people count votes. And it turned out the next day that Corey Lewandowski was COVID positive and contagious at that moment. One of our staffers actually got COVID from this engagement. One of our volunteers actually got COVID from this engagement, and I suspect some of the Republicans did too. So that was all going on. And I think it may have been Thursday instead of Friday. That was all going on. And at the same time, we had the clown show, because I think Nate's right. Wisconsin had gotten there and been clearly blue. Pennsylvania was the 270th electoral vote. If we won Pennsylvania, we were going to get there. Georgia and Arizona were still weeks out in terms of a likely outcome because they were that close. So it really was about us. And so you had a circus, and Philadelphia was the media circus of the whole thing, which of course led to my favorite story of the whole election, which is Rudy Giuliani at Four Seasons Total Landscaping. I will tell you, I was running the litigation team in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania trying to get ready for this, and we wanted to know what he was going to say. So when I heard about this, I dispatched a staffer to the Four Seasons Hotel, got there and found out it was the wrong place. And they got in their car and drove up to Northeast Philadelphia outside a landscaping shop next to a porn studio across the street from Crematorium. And while that was going on, this was Saturday morning, fortunately, the numbers, one more batch was released by Philadelphia, got us to about a 30,000 vote lead, and they called it. And so it was, but it may be my favorite memory of the whole thing is that whole process. But all of this is going on in parallel. It's all there. And I just want to add two more things. First of all, we had something you've never seen before, which was death threats to election officials running administrations. And I'm not just talking about the people in charge. They're deputies, they're mid-level staffers, anti-Semitic death threats, racial death threats. All of this is not public. It doesn't need to be. Some of it is, and there were multiples. There was arrests of people who came to Philadelphia with guns to try to storm the Capitol. It was two idiots. They got arrested because, frankly, one of their friends in, I want to say Virginia or West Virginia, called the cops on them and had them ready to be arrested. But this was going on. It is something we have never seen before in this country, and hopefully we'll never see again. Again, it goes back to the false information and thing was there. The second thing I wanted to add on something Jessica talked about, which is the equipment. When we went to vote by mail in October of 2019, the expectation was that Philadelphia would go from 20,000 or 30,000 paper ballots up to about 100,000. Their mechanism for doing this was a hand count, but they could have done it with some extra people and still been done by Sunday. As Nate mentioned, we had almost 1 million people vote, most of them by mail in Philadelphia. And as a result, we didn't have the equipment. Fortunately, leading into the election, there was an NGO largely funded by Facebook people who gave away millions of dollars to the large counties to upgrade the equipment that Jessica was talking about. We didn't do it. Democrats didn't do it. Republicans didn't do it. It was done. The government didn't do it, which is what should have happened. It was done by this nonprofit. We ended up seeing litigation after that for months, and you're still going to see some of the challenges that are coming ahead. People are somehow arguing that it's not okay for a nonprofit to give money to government to improve elections machinery. It is something that is insane, but it was the savior in Pennsylvania, because if we don't have that equipment, what we found out Saturday morning when Philadelphia got its count in and got us over the hump, that probably doesn't happen for another 3 days, is the best guess people have come up with. And so we would have had 3 more days of that circus. What went from 0 to 4 days, as Nate was talking about, was bad, but imagine day 5, day 6, day 7, day 8. And so the shortage of the equipment and eventually the acquisition of the equipment for the nonprofits was irrelevant to the actual count. Those votes would have been counted, but it was essential for the perception of the count, at least around the country.
Okay, and yeah, you've touched on this already, but some of the litigation after the election, I mean, did any of that have any substance, or was there any success for the challenges to the votes? I mean,
so there were something on the order of 80 lawsuits nationally, about 20 of them in Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign won exactly 1. It was a suit about, we had won this 3-day extension. And there's a provision in the law that says if you vote provisionally, if you go in and you aren't in the book, but you should be, you have to fill out a provisional ballot, and then you have to show them some ID. Or you can mail in your ballot for the first time, and you can vote by mail, but you have to include some ID. If you don't include the ID, you have a 7-day period after the election to come back and fix it. The Secretary of the Commonwealth, without going to court, decided to take the 3 days we'd won at the beginning and put that at the end of the 7 days. So this would only be people who voted by mail or voted provisionally, didn't have ID or didn't include their ID, got a letter or a call telling them to do so, waited 7 days but less than 10 and showed up. So we're talking about less than a dozen people across the whole state. They won that suit, they should have. It was clearly a mistake by the Secretary. We're talking about less than a dozen people. That is their one victory across the whole country in these more than 80 lawsuits. I have never seen a set of lawsuits with less facts, and more importantly, with a greater disconnect between the facts as argued before a tribunal of law, where a judge like Peter could hold them accountable for their statements, and what they say in the media. And what you saw was this great divergence where what was said publicly to rile people up was completely false. And when they got before court to substantiate, they make the allegations in court, but they get before the court and have to substantiate the arguments and put in evidence, and they'd have nothing. Time and time and time again. As I said, more than 80 cases nationwide, more than 20 in Pennsylvania. The only one they won was one really minor technical error that affected someplace between 7 and 12 votes.
okay, Nate. I mean, we're sort of 8 months down the line from the election, and I mean, do you want to summarize some of the main conclusions that we can draw from it? I mean, do you just want to go there?
Well, I wrote an article a little while ago called "The Miracle and Tragedy of the 2020 Election," and it emphasizes sort of these sort of 2 diametrically opposed perspectives on the election. On the one hand, it is a miracle that we were able to pull it off in the way that we did, and not just to provide an adequate election, but to break records when it comes to turnout. And so the massive transition of the election infrastructure to facilitate healthy voting during a pandemic really was the greatest challenge that our elections had faced, probably since the Civil War, if not including that. And so that really is a takeaway here, is that the election officials are heroes and that they really rose to the task. The flip side of that, though, is, as we sort of just glossed on this with talking about the post-election lawsuits, is that you have a erosion in American public opinion with respect to the functioning of our democracy. And so that you now have incredible polarization among Republicans and Democrats as to whether this election was free and fair and whether Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. It remains to this day that a majority of Republicans in polls continue to think that the election was either stolen or was not free and fair, or was fundamentally marred by fraud. And so there isn't, as Kevin was saying, there isn't a kind of consistent narrative as to what actually was the irregularity. And that's one of the things that came out in these lawsuits, is that there was a kind of heterogeneity to the allegations of misdeeds. So it's everything from Dominion voting systems, which was the voting machine that was used in Georgia, to Sharpie markers in Maricopa County, which were alleged to mess with the paper ballots, to election official malfeasance, to dead people voting and the like, right? So it's not as if we were identifying like one issue, such as the dangling chads in the 2000 election, but this scattershot approach has nevertheless taken root in American public opinion among Republicans, as those flames have been fanned by President Trump, so that you now have a significant chunk, tens of millions of people who believe there's a fundamental problem in the fairness of American elections. And that does not appear to be going away. If anything, because of the actions at the state level that we've seen in the aftermath of the election, what's become known as the big lie that the election was stolen, is fueling actual tangible legislative proposals at the state level to make changes, some to just go back on these adaptations that were made for the infrastructure of COVID, but in some cases to go even further and make it more difficult to vote, as well as to sort of put in the crosshairs these nonpartisan election officials who were just doing their jobs and did them heroically, and to replace those folks with partisan officials.
And this is different from 2000 when it was Bush and Gore. I remember that, and that was very controversial. That went on for a very long time till eventually I think Al Gore said enough of this when I think they've been to the Supreme Court 2-3 times. That's very different, is it?
It's different in a lot of respects, but let me highlight one thing that, as I mentioned before, the final result really did come down to those three states. If you had Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia go for Trump, then we would have been in a tied electoral college situation. But suppose that just 5,000 or 6,000 voters in each of Arizona and Georgia had switched their votes, and it all came down to Wisconsin, right? And so we would have had a Bush versus Gore situation where one state was determining the outcome. I think that would have been an even more difficult situation than we confronted, because our polity was not prepared for a Bush versus Gore type situation. You are right that the hanging chads controversy in 2000 ultimately was resolved by the U.S. Supreme Court. Despite his disagreement with the result, Al Gore conceded, and then we moved on. But that was not in the offing in the United States. It's only because we had so many states that had flipped to Biden that we had this kind of cushion that was provided. And then adding on to that, the fact that the media, and I should say a diverse set of media enterprises that had sort of consecrated the victory 4 days afterwards. So that the fact that Fox News joined with the other networks in calling the election, and Fox News was one of the earliest ones to call Arizona, that was very important because it did send a kind of bipartisan signal and legitimacy as to who the victor actually was. But had you not had that, and had we been in limbo waiting for one state, we see what happened when we had 3 states that were hanging in the balance after the election. If we were actually litigating one state as we had in Bush versus Gore, I think it would have been a real disaster.
And Jessica, the role of the media in this feeling. I mean, I felt it over here that there was a big body of people who genuinely felt that there was unfairness going on, something had gone wrong. I mean, did the media do anything to help fan those flames, or did they dampen them down, or what are the media again partly to blame for this?
I think that the problem is not necessarily with what the media did in 2020. I think that if the media had been behaving the way that they behaved in 2020 for many years, then these underlying assumptions probably wouldn't exist, right? The media has historically not done a very good job of explaining how the electoral process works or how the count works, because that's not very sexy. That's not very fun to talk about. And in previous elections, we really hadn't had a lot of controversy over the literal count of the ballots, unless you count the year 2000. And so it's just not something that the United States media has ever focused on. And I think that came to a head because it's very easy to sow misinformation into a space where people are ill-informed. And so we pivoted in 2020 and began to really investigate and explain at a nuanced level the vote by mail and the naked ballot and all of these things. But you know, I think it was too late by that point.
Okay, and I'm going to sort of draw this section of the discussion to a close. I mean, let's ask a broad question. Jessica, I mean, this question of trust in democracy in America, I mean, do you think that can be restored? So, for example, can the view of some that's still there, that the election was stolen, eventually be consigned to history, do you think?
I think it's entirely up to the Republican Party. They are the ones driving that narrative. They're the ones that are going to have to back off from it. They're the ones that are going to have to say it wasn't true the entire time. And I think that if they do that, then we can move back to normal more quickly. If they do not, then it's going to take several years of normalization for people to see the transparency of elections, for people to see how effective elections actually are and prove themselves wrong. I don't know if that will actually happen. I think we're waiting on the Republicans.
And just to, sorry, Kevin, yeah.
One quick thing to that is, I do want to call out that the rule of law held, that despite the fact that the media and the public didn't get there, Peter's a good example of a judge, but he wasn't in these cases, but his colleagues on the bench, no matter who appointed them, no matter how they got elected, and for those state judges who were elected, no matter where they came from, by and large, they called balls and strikes the way you want them to. And they were fair and they were direct, and it wasn't a partisan endeavor. There are a few that were exceptions, that people that frankly got overturned on appeals, but by and large, they called it balls and strikes, and the rule of law held. And I will also want to commend, just real quickly on this, my partners at Greenberg Traurig and a bunch of our peers in the big firms, including program sponsor Munger Tolles, who are going above and beyond to make sure that these new laws that are being crafted and sort of pushed through under the perverse guise that Nate talked about are being challenged in court and will be challenged in court and will be contested. The people at the UIA and our colleagues at the bar need to step up and are doing so, and the courts need to keep calling balls and strikes, to use the baseball analogy, but being fair and equal and not being biased one way or the other. We may have had strategic reasons to go to certain courts, but at the end of the day, what we found out is Justice Alito, a far right-wing judge, regularly rejected these claims. Judge Barrett, who everybody thought Trump was putting on the bench to rule for his favor, ruled against him in these cases. The justices and the judges in the United States stepped up and acted in a way that saved us from the kind of disaster that Nate and Jessica are talking about. We shouldn't have it to be judges. It should be the people. It should be our political leaders. But I do want to commend the judges for doing that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that's a big fight. I mean, the last figures I saw, I mean, this is going back to mid-February, there was something like 250 pending bills in 43 states to change the voting methods. I mean, some of them are more controversial than others, but I mean, that just sort of slightly blew my mind in terms of the distinctions. And it really brings home this point about each state does its own thing, it will have its own rules. Just incredibly complicated. Nate, do you think there are other areas for reform that we might want to consider, or America might consider, in order to, going forward?
Well, there's a lot of areas for potential reform, and your viewers should know that there is a bill that has been proposed in Congress, two bills actually. Now, the For the People Act, otherwise known as HR1 or S1, is a massive election overhaul bill that would deal with all kinds of these election infrastructure issues, dealing with mail balloting, dealing with other aspects of voting rights, as well as issues of campaign finance and gerrymandering and the like. That is sort of stalled for the moment because there's a question as to whether the critical senator who determines the outcome of everything, the Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, whether he's willing to overturn the filibuster for this voting reform. But there's there's a lot of room for improvement. I mean, the idea that we had to have private philanthropists shell out $500 million for local jurisdictions to fund their elections is a national embarrassment. That we don't fund elections and fund our democracy in the way that we need to. And so one hope would be that whether through the infrastructure bill or other kinds of appropriations, that we take elections seriously and make sure that these local officials have what they need in order to pull off a successful election. So just as you're seeing these reforms at the federal level, you are seeing many of these changes at the state level, some of which are more serious than others. The most serious concern I have is with the shift away from election officials, nonpartisan election officials, toward more partisan officials to be the ones who, in the end, could determine the outcome of elections and the administration of them. But every sort of aspect of the COVID adaptation is under review now. So whether it's ballot drop boxes, or whether it's mail ballots and how you verify them, or whether it is aspects of the in-person voting experience and things like drive-through voting or mobile voting or curbside voting, right? All of these different ways, or 24-hour voting, all these different ways that the local election officials tried to make voting easier. Now you're seeing a rollback or an intended rollback of those procedures at the state level.
Okay, I mean, just to draw this part of the session to a close, I mean, what struck me, the figures speak for themselves. 159 million votes cast, 67% of the electorate turned out, which are amazing figures. So, I mean, to an extent, one congratulates all of those who are involved in the process and managed to see this through for a very difficult time. But I think it's probably time to turn to Michael, who's been sitting patiently listening to our conversation to get more of a global view on this. Michael, I'll put it to you. Do you think trust in democracy has been eroded by what happened in America?
I think the short answer to that is it's too early to tell, because in the absence of survey data, we can't really know what are the developing attitudes around the world to democracy or to any number of other issues for that matter. So we can really only speculate on that at this point. One should probably also draw a distinction between short-term effects and long-term effects, and long-term effects are even more difficult to assess in this sort of time frame, though they may turn out to be the more significant ones when we look back in 50 years' time or something like that. I do think you can make some broad observations, though, from first principles. The first thing I'd say is that trust is very much a state of mind. So you really have to ask yourself the question, whose mind are we talking about? Are we talking about trust around the world on the part of other governments? Are we talking about political elites in countries other than the USA? Are we talking about the world media? Are we talking about scholars and academics? Are we talking about the average man on the street, the person on the Bogota or Cairo omnibus? And they may all have very different perspectives and are likely to, in fact. There is a real risk, and this is the second point I'd make, in thinking about the world as the USA and the rest, because there is vast variation across the world in attitudes that you'll find from country to country. What's happening in the USA, surprisingly enough, doesn't necessarily dominate the news all over the world. Even if it does so for a day or two, things move on. Right now, the thing that is dominating the news everywhere in the world is the COVID pandemic, and what sometimes gets forgotten, the massive economic disruption that is producing in people's lives, which is far more salient to them on a day-to-day basis than the state of democracy in the USA. So even the biggest stories are going to move on in the eyes of many, many people around the world. Another point that's worth making is that trust in democracy, in inverted commas, is not necessarily the same as satisfaction with the way in which your country is being governed by a particular government, or by the way in which governance in your country more broadly is unfolding. And it's those sorts of locally focused things that are more likely to be picked up in survey data than abstract questions of people as to where they think democracy is heading. People may well be very unhappy with their governments and the way they're working, but still like the idea that they can change those governments without having to resort to violence. A fourth point I think is worth bearing in mind is that for an awful lot of observers, the 2020 election is only a footnote. It's one milestone in a longer term pattern of decay of US democracy. And perceptions around the world aren't going to necessarily focus on the arcane details of how elections are run and electoral disputes. they're going to be looking at things like, what is it about the USA that in the Second Amendment that enables a 2-year-old to shoot the mother in a shop? They'll look at the oddities of the Trump presidency, which were reported quite extensively all over the place. They look at the way in which the USA didn't handle the COVID pandemic well, which I think Stephen Walters made the point that draws into question the basic ability of the country to function in a competent manner. Perceptions of the USA are also very much influenced by who is the president at a particular time, because that is the representative for all practical purposes in other people's minds of the country. And sometimes you go through a period when you have very good presidents, as historians suggest was the case with Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower. It's been a much more mixed set of perceptions since, with some people seeing a rather bad sense of how the USA was going under George W. Bush. Then they became much more optimistic with Obama, who was a much more popular character around the world. And then we've had the Trump experience. So that also influences views. Among those of us who have a more technical interest in American democracy and how it's functioning, there are also longer term things that have been going on that really influence perceptions. And that we've talked about some of them today, the way in which the Electoral College can reverse the popular vote, the way in which the Senate has become a minoritarian institution because the small states have the same power as the big states, and there's a correlation between the way the small states vote and the big ones do. And of course, then the filibuster further enforces that minoritarian character. You have legislative gerrymandering going on both the state and the congressional level. You've got issues about the partisan character of election administration. You have the amount of money that's floating around in election campaigns. All this ongoing discussion now about vote suppression, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court some years back with more apparently in prospect. So these are all sort of nasty things ticking away in the background, and the 2020 election may well exemplify some of them, but it's not the whole picture. Another point I think that's worth bearing in mind is that the notion that the USA is the democracy of the world that the rest of the world is looking to for inspiration is a dated one. Come the end of the Second World War, it was probably much more realistic. There were only 51 countries at that point that even signed the UN Charter. There's now of the order of 190 countries. A lot of them were not democracies as we understand it. There were basically no democracies in Africa. There were no independent democracies in the Pacific. There was very little in Southeast Asia. All of these countries have now either gone democratic or have had a transition which may have slipped away. And in some cases, their neighbours have gone democratic, so they see what's going on there as well. So attitudes to democracy as a concept are much more likely now to be shaped by people's domestic experience of how it works in their country, what's gone wrong, than what's happening in the USA. And when you have democracy reformers in places like Hong Kong, Myanmar, talking about what they want in their country, it's their domestic model of democracy that they're thinking about. They're not thinking about the Electoral College or those sorts of things. And to the extent that there are external influences, they are more diverse now. You have involvement with the UN and the European Union in helping democracy promotion and those sorts of things, so that the USA is no longer a monopoly supplier of democracy and ideas about democracy in the way that it was 75 years ago. Truth be told, I cannot think of a single institutional feature, and I emphasize institutional feature of US democracy, that you could recommend in good conscience to any other country that was trying to improve its democracies, which is a sad thing to have to say, but I do believe it. Leading on from that, if there is going to be a major influence of what's happening in the US on democracy around the world, it may well be as what they used to call a horrible example of what can happen if things go wrong, if you get complacent, if you believe that you're the best and therefore nothing can be improved, and you take your eye off the ball when it comes to things that are plainly in need of action. And frankly, the way in which certain senators have decided the filibuster is more important than all these other dimensions of democracy is pretty terrifying from a point of view of democracy promotion. So people can look at that around the world and actually learn some lessons from that, which may be good lessons, that you shouldn't be complacent, that you should pay attention to opportunities for improvement and take them where they exist. Another benefit, I think, is that the US has experienced, both in 2016 and 2020, has put right on the agenda for everybody the notion of foreign interference in elections, which was not the sorts of things that media, governments, or election administrators had to worry about too much in the past. And I'm actually seeing it now in my region of the world, that a lot of administrators are putting a lot of effort into making sure that their mechanisms for detecting and dealing with this problem are quite robust. So there's that to be hoped for. Really, when you build on from that, I think it also highlights that there is a danger in having too much faith in institutions. And I used to hear this argument quite a lot about the USA, that maybe our politicians are not so great, but the institutions are very strong and they're developed, and there's separation of powers and all these sorts of things. I think one of the lessons of the last few years is really the institutions are only as strong as the quality of the people who are in them. And if you get the wrong people in institutions at a particular time and they're in a critical position to influence things for good or ill, they can really damage things. I saw Brian Klass from London School of Economics, I think, had a Twitter feed today having a metaphor of these institutions as a sandcastle, which I think is quite a potent one about how they can be washed away in a single wave, or how they can be taken apart grain by grain. Most of what I've said there is fairly negative, so I think I should put in one at least positive comment, that I think a lot of the work that's been done by the US in democracy promotion around the world by bodies like USAID, the National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, IFAS in Washington, and so on, has projected a good image of American democracy, and one which is appreciated in developing countries and is a positive sign. So that's a rather long answer to a rather short question.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, do you sense that there's any risk that what's happened in the States, where you could see similar situations arising in elections in other countries? So, for example, in Europe, we've got important elections coming up in Germany and France fairly soon.
Well, in fact, it's the sort of thing that's arisen quite a lot, but it's typically arisen in third world countries. If you are running an election in a third world country or a post-conflict environment, one of the things you absolutely have to worry about is whether the loser is going to accept the results. And you can find copious examples of that not being done, or acceptance being grudging at best. Cambodia in 1993, where I was working, is one, Angola at about the same time, and much more recently Myanmar. It comes as a surprise when it happens in the USA, because people are conceiving the USA as a firmly established democracy. But if you've done a lot of your work in third world sort of quasi-democracies, actually nothing that's happened in the last 6 or 12 months is particularly surprising. It's part of a different paradigm, which is that of third world problems. So it could again happen. You may see autocrats around the world trying to use what happened in America as a precedent, but I don't think that's going to be very important, because if they have the motives, means, and opportunity to overturn an election, they'll do it anyway. They may be concerned about whether they'll get more blowback from the international community if they try it. And we're yet to see really how the Biden administration is going to approach that. Nothing terribly constructive seems to have been done on the Myanmar case as yet. And of course, it depends on what future administrations in the US do too. And of course, the US isn't the only possible source of blowback. The European Union and other players can get involved in that as well. More generally, I think that the history that has led the US to this point is really quite distinct. It's got its roots in, well, basically slavery, to be blunt about it, going back to the Civil War. You have features of the partisanship and almost sectarianism of US democracy now that is not necessarily reflected in what you'll find in European countries. Some may have some dimensions of that, others won't have it at all. Others may look at what's happened and recoil from that and say we have to work to make sure that this doesn't happen in our patch. Also, I think the openly partisan character of the individuals who are electoral administrators in the US, which is not to say they always act in a partisan way, but they have partisan attachments that people know about, is something that the rest of the world looks on with amazement and see it as really quite bizarre and would be regarded as improper almost anywhere else in the world. You know, my big concern, and I think most countries would feel this way, is that it's obvious that there's a very significant minority of people in America who now see their side winning as more important than the quality of the process and defending that process. You know, and elections are ultimately a cooperative societal undertaking where you need to have a basic agreement on the rules of the game that they are the sole mechanism for conferring ultimate political legitimacy on a government. And once you get away from that social consensus, democracy is on the skids. And that, I think, is the scariest scenario we're looking about. None of this is actually going to say that things aren't going to get worse in the US. And frankly, my guess, if I had to bet on it, is that the last free and fair elections are going to be, you know, in the next 5 or 10 years, and then there's going to be a long, long period of trouble. And if the US slides into an authoritarian government, that's going to have incalculable consequences for the world system. But that isn't necessarily able to be tied back to the specific events of the 2020 election.
Okay, and then Kevin has talked quite a lot about the litigation, and I mean, I find for me from the UK that's a very odd situation to see a lot of litigation around elections. But do you think it's a bad thing that elections are subject to robust scrutiny from the courts, or indeed other oversight, or subject to challenge by the participants? I mean, is that something that's common? I mean, do you think it's a bad thing, or?
Well, far from being a bad thing, it's generally regarded as a fundamental requirement for free and fair elections. And you'll find this in the Interparliamentary Union's Declaration on Criteria for Free and Fair Elections that sets out an obligation of states to ensure that violations of human rights and complaints relating to the electoral process are determined promptly within the timeframe of the electoral process and effectively by an independent and impartial authority such as an electoral commission or the courts. So it's actually a standard process that you find all around the world. And I don't actually have any sort of problem with that. And I think most people wouldn't. The bigger problem that one sees coming out of the 2020 election is the abusive process that Kevin has talked about. The sort of litigation outside the courtroom of preposterous and scandalous allegations which can't be supported by evidence and which do no credit to the people making them who call themselves legal professionals. So that becomes a serious sort of problem. And ultimately, when you get the courts involved or when you get an independent electoral commission involved, as sometimes done if you're in a post-conflict situation and the courts aren't trusted, what you are looking for is a definitive resolution of disputes. And if you get to the point where a large number of people don't see a set of court rulings as definitive in that way, then in that sense, the dispute resolution process hasn't resolved the disputes. It's going to endure and bubble away in the community in the long term. Speaking as an Australian, I'd have to say the diverse and sort of bifurcated character of the legal process, as Kevin has described it earlier, to my way of thinking, works against having a process where these issues are definitively resolved, because I've seen complaints from the right saying, well, that never got to the Supreme Court. If we'd been able to take it to the court, we might have got a different sort of ruling. In Australia, by way of contrast, all federal election disputes, every single one of them, goes directly to the High Court of Australia, which is our equivalent of the Supreme Court. So whatever you get out of the judiciary by way of a resolution is coming from the top, and it potentially addresses every issue that a litigant has wanted to be able to raise. So that's, from my perspective, looks like a cleaner mechanism for getting that sort of resolution of disputes that is not just technically right from a legal point of view, but enjoys the public support. I can't see really a simple resolution to this problem in an era when so many people look at the judges and say, well, they were appointed by Trump or they were appointed by Obama, and infer from that some sort of partisan affiliation. So that when people on the extremes see a loss in court, they're just as likely to see the judges as traitors rather than people who've done the right thing and tried to behave in the way that Kevin has described and followed the law. Ultimately, you're getting to a point where people don't care about the rule of law anymore, and that's a very scary thing.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think what I'm going to do is, we've got a bit of time left, is just turn it over to some questions. I don't know if Peter is there and has been keeping an eye on things. Peter, you got anything interesting for us?
Yes, we do. We have actually a couple of questions, two general questions and then one specific for Michael. The first question is, does the 2020 election mean that the loser in US presidential elections will regularly attack the count as being illegitimate and try to overturn the results through the courts?
I hope not. I do expect that we will see more of this.
You still with us, Kevin? We can still hear you. I think we can still hear you. Does somebody else want to pick that
Well,
up?
I'm happy to jump in on this. So I think that, you know, we're entering a vicious cycle here where it's not just the right that will be complaining about the freedom and fairness of the elections, but now because of the reforms that are coming in, you're going to see it on the left. So if, as I suspect, the Democrats lose control of Congress in 2 years, right, you can easily see how claims that the legal changes that were enacted post 2020 had a dispositive impact on that election.
So somebody just told me we're still there. I apologize. We've lost power here for much of this. I'm gonna cool off.
That's all right, Kevin. Don't worry. Sorry, Nate.
Anyway, so that you could see recommendations following that path, so that it wouldn't just be the right, but it would also be the left in the U.S. that would be saying that the elections were not free and fair. And so I am worried about that. I think Jessica is right that, look, it just depends on what kind of signals, if we are getting any bipartisan legitimacy enhancing signals from political elites, but we haven't seen that as of yet, right? And none of these election reform bills that we're seeing at the federal or the state level are getting bipartisan support. And so the whole idea of the mechanics of US democracy is now becoming a partisan topic. And that is not exactly fertile ground for kind of general consensus in the mass public over the sort of favorability and fairness of the election infrastructure.
Jessica, did you want to come in on that? Sorry.
Yeah, you know, I think that Nate is absolutely right. I think that, you know, I've been having conversations with Republicans about when their party kind of realigns itself. And I get these answers that are always in the future, right? Like, well, you know, Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, is really just waiting for Trump's endorsement. And so once he gets Trump's endorsement, then he'll back down on voting rights and he'll start, you know, realigning. And that didn't happen. And, you know, I think we're setting these future goals saying that, you know, in the future, when Trump is not as important to my polling numbers as right now, then I will speak out about these things, which is like a level of fealty that I can't really wrap my mind around. But I think that the Republicans need to just kind of come to terms with the fact that Trump is never going to be irrelevant until they make him irrelevant. And so until they make that decision on their own, I think that we're in quite a pickle.
Okay, Peter, I mean, any other questions for us?
Yes, a couple more. One more general one. Is there any drive to change the election process so that every American's vote counts equally and electoral colleges are no longer relevant? And if not, why not?
Well, so the Electoral College is in the US Constitution. And so in order to change that system, we would have to amend the Constitution. There is a move afoot called the National Popular Vote Plan, which would basically allow, through sort of machinations of state law, so that a majority vote at the national level would then lead a majority of states or majority of electoral votes in the states to be cast for the winner. So the idea would be that state legislatures, irrespective of what the population decides, would ratify the vote of whoever got a national majority. There are a lot of both constitutional and logistical problems with that, because one of the things people don't realize is we don't have a national election authority in the US. And I mentioned this before, but in contrast to most other states, we don't have a national official who says this is how many votes each candidate got for president. Actually, if there is a national election authority in the US, it's the Associated Press, right? For the reasons that Jessica mentioned, which is that you have the press that is making assumptions and modeling about who actually won the election. And then when it comes to national, like political election authorities, administrative authorities in the US, the closest thing that's now comes to a national election authority is the US Postal Service, because they're going to be the ones who are handling the most ballots as compared to any other elections authority in the US. And so in order to change the Electoral College, you would need a majority of, you'd need to amend the Constitution. In general, right now, that's a partisan issue with Democrats that would probably support changing the Electoral College and Republicans opposing it.
I mean, we have the same problem. We have the same problem in the UK, Peter, because when it comes to a general election of 500 different constituencies, there's usually about 40 or 50 that really matter, and which way they swing means you get a certain prime minister or a different one, and everybody else's vote doesn't really count. So it's slightly frustrating over here as well. I think that it's a form of democracy, which it's democracy, but it's not perfect. But there we are.
And then the next question, the next question is actually for Michael Marley. The question is whether he can comment on the role of quote unquote guardrails in U.S. democracy, and as well as the role and prospects for free courts, free journalism, and civilian control of the military.
I think the point I'd make about guardrails is that from the perspective of a political science, the key role there is normally one that's played by political parties, and as what you might call gatekeepers of democracy. And I can't really overstate the extent to which the world may be mystified by the way in which insurgents like Mr. Trump on the Republican side or Senator Sanders on the Democratic side are able to come in through the primary process and in effect take over a party as a hostile takeover. And that really is a significant guardrail, because a lot of people who are voting in primaries are voting expressively, or they're voting for an image that they've acquired through the media rather than any really detailed knowledge of the personal qualities or characteristics of the candidate. Same is true to a certain extent in the choice of the UK Conservative Party leader, where you have party members voting, and similarly, people are voting on images rather than trusting party officials to make sound judgments about who has got quality and who will be good when they're in government. Now, obviously, the primaries were brought in because there were issues with the way in which the party officials used to work in bygone days. But around the world, it is much more typical that the parties, organisations and the members of a party will determine who is going to be their candidate, and then the democracy comes when the voters choose which of them they want, rather than building in the involvement of citizens through the primary process. And once you have this prospect of a sort of monolithic or duolithic two-party system, which is susceptible to takeover by insurgents, the role of guardrails is very much difficult to implement anywhere else in the process because of the centrality of the parties. it's strange that such almost a viral process has unfolded before our eyes in the same time as a real virus has been mucking up the world.
Yeah, I think actually, so I noticed actually, everybody, we've hit 4:30. In fact, we've just gone beyond. So we might have to call it a day there. But thank you all very, very much. It's been fascinating for me, sort of talking to you all over the last few weeks, and actually, listening to you all today. So thank you very much to the whole of our panel, and also again to the sponsors, to Munger, Tolles and Olsen, Graydon, your law officers, James Seymour, and I'll make a plug for my own firm, of course, Farrer & Co. Also thanks to the organising committee. Peter didn't say that he was on the organising committee as well, but he was, and many conversations there. And also to John Pinney, Murray Levin, and Grant Davis-Denny. And finally, thanks to the UIA Centre. Colette has her camera off. She's very modest, but amazing assistance throughout for all of this. And thank you to everybody who's joined us. And if you're not a member of the UIA and you found this interesting, we have lots of these conversations. So please do join us and come to some more. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.